So today we're gonna continue down the path of my videos where I was not able to find this information in one spot online. I had to find it in a lot of different spots. So last video it was nodes, and this video is gonna be normal map baking. Uh, it's not really that hard to do normal map baking, but there are a couple things that can improve your bakes or can kind of be annoying if you don't fully know what you're doing. So to start off, this is obviously a very simple thing. It's just two cubes. But even this can have a lot of issues with normal map baking. So this video is going to kind of assume that you know what normal maps are, that kind of thing. But the super quick version is basically you can take a high poly mesh and bake it onto a lower poly mesh so it looks like it has a lot more detail than it actually does. And you can save on polygon counts and stuff, which is good for people like me who is in video game art. So as you can see here, I've got a low poly mesh, literally just that, and I'll show you what the UV looks like. Obviously with normal map baking, the low poly has to have a good UV layout. This is super simple, so as long as they're all not touching, it's not that big of a deal. And I have my high poly mesh here, which is the same thing, just beveled. So we want to get that information onto the other mesh without having to beef up the poly count on that low poly. So I'm just going to bake this out in Substance Painter and show you what the issues are. Okay, so now that we're in Substance Painter, we're just going to hit New up here in the top, press File, New, and select your low poly mesh. I'm going to pick 2K for our document resolution. It really depends on the prop that you're using, but 4K is pretty big, so we're not going to use that here. It really depends on the level of detail you need and the size of your prop. But 2K is fine just for this example. Let's discard that because that was just a practice one. So just press F here to get it all in the scene, and you can see I got my UV here, my 3D object here, and all we do is usually you'll see layers here, but if you just hit texture set settings and bake mesh maps is where you're going to be baking. So make sure your output size is set to the same as your UV map size, and it says high definition meshes right here. Hit this little piece of paper and click your high poly mesh. So we're going to be worrying about this stuff a little bit later, but if we just bake this now, it looks like it's working pretty well. But if you zoom in, you can see that it's kind of worked, but there's like these ugly black lines going along the edges here that just don't look very nice. And same up here. This one worked a little bit better, but there's a way we can make sure that this never happens, these issues. So you can also have issues where, because these two are overlapping, it can bleed onto the other mesh, which I guess in some cases you might want that, but to make sure that that doesn't happen, we're going to do two different things in Blender to fix that problem. Okay, so the way we fix this is how we shade the low poly and the high poly versions. So if we click on the low poly version, or sorry, the high poly version, this is shaded smooth. If it was shaded flat, you would see these little edges here. So we want it to look very smooth, so we're going to shade that smooth. In order to bake this properly, the low poly also has to be shaded smooth, which looks terrible when you see it for the first time. And when I first started doing this, I thought, oh, well, I'll fix that if I just do auto smooth. It looks better now, and it's still technically shaded smooth, but that's still going to give you the same issue. So uncheck that. This is how your low poly is it's going to look very ugly. But all we care about is what the high poly looks like. We want this one to look nice, and we're going to be baking it onto the uglier one. So that's the first step we need to do to fix those little edges that were going along the sides. To fix any bleeding that happens, when any two objects like these are overlapping or are very close together, the normal map can bleed onto the other parts of the mesh or the other mesh. So what we need to do is separate them. So if I go into edit mode, I can just press L when I'm hovered over it, press P, selection. We're just going to rename this to top piece underscore low. This underscore low is very important, and actually both of it is very important, but all your low poly meshes have to have the same suffix. So underscore low, underscore low. It can be whatever you want. It can be literally anything. Like use underscore L, underscore high, underscore H, whatever you want. But we have to do the same thing with the high poly mesh. So we'll hide the low poly. Same thing. And rename this to top piece underscore high. So if we export these again, as the high poly, select both of the low polys, export them together. As low poly, make sure you have selected objects only on, because that could cause some issues. And then we go back into Substance Painter. We're gonna go to Edit Project Configuration and pull in your LP again, because we've updated it. So as you can see, it looks terrible. It kind of looks like it did in Blender. So if we go back into Mesh Maps, this is where we're gonna deal with this stuff down here. This is the low poly mesh suffix and high poly mesh suffix. This is where you type in whatever you named it for your low poly and for your high poly. I just named it the same as this, so it's easier. I don't have to change anything. And then we have a little match section here, and do by mesh name. That's why we had to name them both top piece underscore high and top piece underscore low, and then base, and so on. Now if we bake it, you can see that when I zoom in, those edges look a lot better. Still some issues, but what is causing these issues is actually not the mesh bake, it's actually the unwrap. Because they're all in different spots here, it doesn't transfer onto the other UVs very nicely. So if we go back into Blender, and I've accidentally already done it, but if you just, mark some seams to make it nicer, press U and unwrap it properly. I'm just going to straighten this out really quick, just to make sure that the normals look nice. And then we send it back again with low poly. One more time, well, not one more time, a couple more times, but switch out the low poly again. See, obviously it's not looking very nice, but we bake that, and we come in up tight here, and from afar you'd have no idea. You'd think that was beveled, right? If you come up to the edge and look like this, like obviously you're going to be able to see that it's not, because it isn't beveled, but it looks a lot nicer than that original one we had. Even if we slap a smart material on there, like something with some ambient occlusion, you can see it looks really nice. And one more thing we can do is add a little bit more detail to these meshes, a little bit more I guess intricate things that you can put in that can really add a lot more detail to your mesh. So again, we have I got my high poly here, and we want to add some like little dips kind of in these corners. And so the way you could do this is like kind of add some like geometry in here, but that's just adding a lot more work to make it look nice, and it's not needed. So I already kind of made these little things here, which are just little cups. They're just, all they are is little things floating above the mesh. I actually found out about this technique from a guy named Warren on YouTube. I'll link him in the description. He's a professional at this. He knows a lot more than I do, so if you want more information about this stuff, definitely go check out his channel. But to kind of paraphrase what he taught me, basically, is that these there's a normal on every face. Basically, there's an edge normal that comes out from the edge, there's a face normal that comes out from the face, and there's vertex normal too. And these vertex normals are facing outwards like this on a 45, right? Because it's averaging these two faces, so it's coming right out. So when it is pointing out this way and this one's pointing out this way, those rays from the normal map are going to come in on an angle, right? So it's going to look nice in the middle, but it's going to skew on the outside. So to show you what that looks like, first I'm going to need to incorporate these into the mesh, because like I mentioned earlier, they have to line up. So like the base high has to have a base low, top piece high has to have a top piece low. Since there's no low low poly version of these. These are just the high poly version. We're gonna have to incorporate that into this base piece. So all I'm gonna do, make sure that these, okay, yep. Click them both, join them together. So now it's one piece, and you can see it's like that. So if I re-export the high poly, like that, go back in the Substance Painter. True, let's just remove that and put it back in to make sure it's updated. And we bake it. You can see they're showing up there. But we have two problems. First of all, like I said, they're skewed, right? Like they're not right in the middle. And second of all, these look terrible. And the reason for this is the cage isn't big enough. So what a cage is basically the normal map. It's basically telling what the normal map, how much of the high poly mesh to incorporate into the low poly mesh. So if there's like a floater up here, you're gonna have to make a bigger mesh to incorporate all of that, or bigger cage, sorry. You can make your own cage. For this example, I'm not gonna, just, it's kind of more work, but, and it's, in this you don't really need to. It's just when you go to bake mesh map, you can see, you use cage file, it's where you'd put it in if you want to, but we're just gonna use these sliders. So the max frontal distance is basically how big it is coming off of it. The max rear distance is how, how far in you're going on the inside of the cube, so in case you have like indents. So we're going to turn up that max frontal distance to around there. Doesn't really matter. You can already see it's looking a lot different, right? We've included that entire thing, so the entire piece is getting put on there. But again, obviously this is skewed. So if we jump back into Blender and we show the low poly version, the way we can fix this is by putting some loop cuts in here. I find this to be the easiest way, just because it really adds like no geometry, like just 4 loop cuts here. And if you look at the normals, these ones are very intense on the side going 45, and these ones are already going straight up. So anything in between there is going straight up, right? So if we just export that, or this is another issue that you might accidentally run into. Putting those loop cuts in there will probably mess up your mesh a bit. So we just unwrap it again, put it back to wherever it was. Make sure that these, for this example, doesn't really need to look, the unwrap doesn't need to be perfect. But if we export that as our low poly again, go back into Substance Painter, go edit project configuration, switch out the low poly. Again, I moved the mesh, so it's a little weird, but if we bake it this time, make sure we still have by mesh name low and high, same settings up here, and bake it. You can already see that those are way better. They are straight down, and they look like they little cups. Obviously the little bad resolution here, just because it's a tiny piece. I could have like made that bigger and put it up here, but for this, you get the idea of how it works. If I throw a material on there again, you can see, oh, it's not a great material. You can see it looks like it looks like you got a beveled cube here. This one's up here looking nice and beveled too. Looks like you got little cups in your mesh, and you've added a lot of detail on something that really is very minimal triangles. So especially in game art, that's very, very important to have. This is like under 30 triangles, and you've already got something that would be way more if you were actually going to model this. So I hope you found this useful. It was just a lot of different issues that I ran into. I tried to put them all into the same video. I know I jumped around a bit from program to program. There are different places you can bake normals, like there's different softwares for it. I find this one just to be the easiest because you can just like throw on smart materials to see how it looks. You can also texture in here. I know Marmoset is also one that I've baked in before, and it works just as well. It's just you don't get the texture in there as well. You can also bake in Blender. I think Blender's kind of a annoying way to do it. There's a lot of different steps you have to do, whereas this, you literally just press bake mesh maps. So thank you for watching, and I hope you found this helpful.